Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on fundraising in the time of COVID-19. Thank you so much for joining in on this webinar, and a huge thank you to Go Fundraise for sponsoring this webinar and making it happen, especially at such a short notice. My name is Catherine Raskub. I'm the Chief Executive of Fundraising Institute Australia. Early last week, several members contacted FIA to ask for data or other information on how charities are managing their fundraising during this incredibly challenging time, particularly off the back of the recent bushfire emergency response. FIA quickly began to draft a survey when More Strategic and Donor Republic contacted me about their plan to also quickly get some research into market. And so we joined forces to put out one survey to FIA members and across the sector more broadly to understand the current, short, and longer-term issues fundraisers are facing and their ideas and plans to manage through. Fundraisers in Australia are a strong and collaborative community, and so coming together to help each other comes second nature to us, and FIA are here to help facilitate that. We also thought that a webinar that presents the results would be helpful, and so asked Go Fundraise for their assistance, and they immediately came to our assistance. Our original thought was that about 50 fundraisers would join the webinar and that we could look at the results and have a discussion together. However, over 1,000 people have registered, signaling incredible demand for this information, and so here we are. FIA are beefing up additional resources to help you and adding more daily to our website, as well as links to our sister organizations internationally who are feeling the same impact as we are here in Australia. We are also working with government and have provided a holistic view of the challenges the sector is facing and why and specifically what kind of assistance we need. FIA will continue to respond to and advance the issues we face as a sector. And we are here for you, so please contact us anytime. Today's webinar recording will be available once we finish here today, and will be sent an email to all participants with a link. In terms of the structure for today, Martin Paul, FIA Fellow and 2020 Arthur Venn Fundraiser of the Year and Director of More Strategic, and Marcus Blees, also a Fellow of FIA and Director of Donor Republic, will present an overview of the survey, including the process and the results. They'll work through the key issues and concerns of each fundraising area raised in the survey. Please note your questions and use the chat function to do this. And Helen Merrick, FIA Executive Manager, Marketing and Membership, will collate the questions. And if there is time near the end, we will try to address these. We'd like to reiterate that the current climate we are in is unprecedented, and no one has all the answers. We are not here to pretend that we do. Rather, we are hoping to present information that will facilitate ongoing sharing, collaboration, and discussion to get us through these tough times. There are many issues and equally many solutions, and we do need to avoid panic and think carefully in a smart and strategic way. Now I'll hand over to Martin Paul of More Strategic to begin. Martin will need to take off his mute.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think to reiterate, we don't have the answers, but I think collectively, the 1,000 people who eventually will be on this webinar, if we can get everybody on, will have those answers. And the good news is that from the survey, 423 people have already shared their views on what their organisation is doing. And that comes from across 196 different organisations. Now, I can't pretend that this is representative, but we did have over half the respondents were from organisations with a turnover of less than $5 million. Marcus, can we move to the first slide? So you can see here that we've got a fairly reasonable spread of organisations by size. We tended to have more CEOs responding to the survey in smaller organisations and more fundraising managers responding from larger organisations, which is really a reflection just of the organisational size. But I think the volume of response is actually a demonstration, not just of the level of concern people have about this issue, but of our general sense of it as a sector of our willingness to share and help each other. So this is us at our best when we're sharing our knowledge and experience for the benefit of everybody. As we can see on the next slide, I've tried to capture the things that people are worrying about. So we had a couple of questions in the survey, which were broad, open-ended questions about your concerns. And essentially, these come into sort of 6 categories, really. The first are just these practical things. There's just a heap of stuff we can't do anymore. We can't go out and have the events that we were planning to hold. We can't meet with our major donors that we were hoping to have conversations with. We're worried about what's going to happen to our face-to-face supply in the future. We can't connect with our volunteers in the same way. And we're worried about will our suppliers be able to continue functioning. So there's practical stuff. Beyond that, then there's a sort of a slightly longer term issue or medium term issue about what's going to happen as a result of the economy, and how is this going to affect particularly our higher value funders, whether that be the major donors, trusts who have reduced funding, or even government who will have pumped so much money into the economy to keep us going. How will we cope with that? Linked to the economic situation is people's sort of confidence and capacity to give. So with reduced income, will people actually not only have money, but feel they can afford to actually donate to charities? And this flows into the issue of sort of confidence, I suppose. So whilst we've got an issue about, do I have enough money? Do I feel I'm in a position to actually donate to charities at the moment? And this is as much a psychological thing as a public confidence thing. People are distracted, overwhelmed. It's just every day when you're reading all of the news, you're just looking, going, we've had bushfires, we've had floods, now we've got coronavirus. Where's the good news in the world? And I think maybe that's a role that we can play. And of course, ultimately, all of this leads to great concern about whether we'll be able to deliver our services to the people who need us most, and particularly in these times. One person in the survey commented about, whilst we've all sort of made a little bit of a joke out of the toilet paper issue, if you're running a food bank and you've got vulnerable people, they can't get hold of toilet paper, they can't get hold of hand sanitization resources. So this is actually impacting frontline services enormously at a time when we're going to be really struggling to cope with that. And then people are worried a little bit about, you know, what's going to happen if we've all postponed events and then suddenly they're all back in a very short space of time, and how do we manage not overwhelming people? And finally, there are a range of concerns that people have about realistic expectations for the future, particularly boards and senior managers expecting you to have answers that you just don't have. And hopefully that's what we can at least equip you with today, is to know that you're not alone in not having all the answers, and you're not alone in not knowing what's going to happen in the future. So actually being able to share, hopefully, these resources and this slide deck with your managers will help address some of that. One of the biggest issues for people, though, generally is the issue of how long is this going to last? So many people commented that we'll probably be okay. We've got reserves. They'll keep us covered for a while. But if this becomes an enduring and long drawn out crisis, as it may, then we might be in trouble. So fundraisers overall, you can see here, are generally thinking that this is going to at least impact fundraising for the remainder of this year. And it'll probably be 2 years before we start to see the signs of recovery. And that sort of impact is slightly more immediate on smaller organizations. At a broad level, we asked, how do people feel? And I think we're probably in keeping with the population, though I haven't seen research on public attitude at the moment. But essentially, a quarter of us are feeling sort of 5 out of 5 on an emotional intensity level at the moment. We can also consider, how worried are we? Because I think one of the things a lot of people are reflecting on is, am I the only person who feels this way? Is everybody else thinking differently about this? And as we can see on this chart, we can see that actually 15 people out of our 371 who answered this question are actually quite optimistic and think their impact will be okay. Thanks, Marcus. But we see that the majority actually are looking in that sort of 6 and 7 in terms of their level of concern. Now, the over 10 million charities, $10 million turnover charities, are much less likely to say it could impact their very existence. But we've actually got 33 charities, that's 16% of all those under $5 million, who actually think this crisis could threaten the existence of their charity. The big question that everybody wants to be able to answer, and probably their boards are going to be asking, because it will determine the ability to deliver frontline services, is how will this impact our fundraising for the remainder of the year? Again, most of us, I think, are somewhat guessing here. We don't really know, but perhaps we can go a little bit here with the wisdom of the crowd and accept that across all the respondents to this survey, over half of us think that fundraising income will be down by more than 20% over the next 9 months for the remainder of this year. So attitudinally and discussion-wise, you know, this isn't based on evidence, this is based on the feel of many of those organisations. Some can, of course, point to specific events and activities that have already been cancelled. For the rest of us, we really don't know, because one of the issues that is pertinent and came out from the survey was this has come at, just before we hit peak fundraising period for many organisations, with the majority of our appeal income and major gift income coming in the next few months. The likelihood is, of course, that then if there's an impact on our fundraising, that'll impact our services. But encouragingly, quite a few organisations believe they have enough reserves to keep going for a few months. And only 1 in 10 think this will affect their fundraising staffing. And actually 3/4 are saying that they're going to have to cut back on some of their mission delivery. So at the moment, I think we're feeling concerned, but not overly concerned yet, which is probably a good position to be in. We don't want to panic, we want to plan. Before we get into, so Marcus will go through in detail the impact on each of the fundraising program areas, but I thought I'd just reflect for you here on how people imagine it's going to impact each of the major sort of fundraising activities. If we just, if you click Marcus, you can see I think it falls into 3 categories. There's the practical stuff where we really just can't do it. It's going to be devastating because we're already having to cancel activities and events. Then the second area really is around those areas which will be more impacted by the economic and public confidence. So issues that are affecting people's savings, their super programs, the investments of trust and foundations, and people's willingness to make commitment to ongoing support, or questioning their ability to do so if they face job insecurity. And then finally, the last area is where we feel most confident, which is where we've got sort of loyal and established relationships with people, and we're going to be investing in developing those relationships. This is also reflected in how people expect their fundraising investments to change. And again, we can break this down into 3 categories. So the first category is really about delaying and diverting activities in the sort of events and personal relationship space. So Marcus, if you can just, thank you. And the second area is about where we really need to protect our relationships. So many of you commented that corporate partnerships, you know, are quite vulnerable, but you're having difficulty getting in contact with people. You're unsure how you're going to manage some of your mid and major donors, but we really have to work on protecting those areas. And then finally, there are potentially some areas of opportunity. And this is why it's so important for us to have conversations and to bring everybody into these discussions. Because in the space of digital, I had conversations with a couple of people who were quite different opinion about what will happen. Some were, we should put all our money into digital because that's going to be where our supporters are at home. Somebody then said, yeah, but actually digital is going to be very expensive because everybody's going to invest in that space. And then somebody else pointed out, well, maybe digital won't be as expensive because none of the travel industry, entertainment industry, etc., will be in that space. So it's one of those areas where you just don't know, but together we can probably find out and we can share that, that information. And these concerns aren't abstract for people. You know, these are real concerns. Already we can see that 80% of respondents to the survey have cancelled events, largely fundraising or donor relationship events. 74% have implemented work from home policies. And actually most people in the survey felt quite confident about their ability to work from home. The primary concern for people was just how would they stay connected and in relationships with their work colleagues more than anything. And so those of you who haven't yet actually spoken to your boards or met with your key suppliers, I urge you to do so. I'm heartened by the fact that 61% of people say they intend to increase their communications with supporters. So I think that's probably one of the most important things we can actually do. So to look at in a bit more detail of what the likely consequences are for each of the individual channels in the context of what we've just seen, I'll hand over to Marcus.
Excellent, thank you, Martin. And I think just to kind of preface, we could jump into a little bit more detail on some of these key areas. But one of the first things to say is that things could change. So what is being talked about today, next week, because we can see that how we've come so far in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, and it's changing so rapidly, that some of these thoughts or some of these advice may not actually be correct in the next month, 2 months. We just don't know. And it's very top line at this point as well, in that, again, we've got a lot of unknowns, so we're not quite sure exactly how some of these activities will play out, which is where, again, ongoing sharing as a sector is going to be so important over the coming months. And we're going to start with events, just because, as you could see from the slide that Martin excuse me, just had there, this has been the area that has affected more of us than anything else in terms of right now, in terms of our current impact to us as a sector. And this is, of course, for obvious reasons, in terms of gatherings over what now is 100 are prohibited. And these were the first to fall, basically. And so there's been a lot of events, as you can see, 1 in 4 from the survey that you kindly filled out have had to actually cancel or postpone an event. What is great to see, though, is that some organisations are still running with virtual events, and these tend to be, at the moment, they tend to be physical activity events, which is great, but we are seeing reports of people receiving less donations, so less people are fundraising or feel as though they are comfortable asking others to donate, and lower averages donated. That's what's being reported as occurring at this moment in time. But if we look ahead and some of the issues that you may be facing, because you might have an event that's planned for July, June, August, and you're not quite sure what to do. The one thing that we're seeing from, kind of hearing from the sector is, ideally, there's a couple of options. One, try to postpone the event rather than completely cancel. Because obviously, if it's a physical event that you are simply not able to run, in an ideal world, look to postpone that event to later in spring. The slight unknown, of course, is that we don't quite know how long this crisis is actually going to continue. But keep in touch with supporters, postpone and push it back, or don't set a date quite yet. Just let people know that we've postponed the event, and we'll be looking to set a date as soon as we've got further guidance from the government based upon what unfolds with the crisis. The other thing that we're seeing across the sector as well is that some physical events are being looked at in terms of how can we turn into a virtual event. And this would suit some events, not all, but it's one of those things that you might need to think creatively in terms of, well, how could we do this? So as an example, Australia's biggest morning tea. The whole concept and premise of that is around gathering people often in the workplace, which is, of course, the very thing that we're being urged not to do anymore. And so looking at how can we turn that event into, with everyone working from home, how can we hold on to our Australianness as much as possible and actually have what we're doing here with a virtual webinar, but actually just catching up with people virtually with a cup of tea and a slice of cake, and all making a donation, so that we hold on to very traditional Australian things in a time when we are not operating traditionally at all. So think creatively in terms of, can we turn this into a virtual event? Of course, one of the things just to consider, though, is that if we experience lockdowns, as many parts of the world are experiencing, it may also then make some virtual activities not possible. So, for instance, if you look at San Francisco or London, who are literally moving into that stage of you cannot really leave your house. then of course we need to rethink those activities as well. So that's something just to keep in mind. With any of these virtual events or peer-to-peer activities at the moment, key things are you're going to have to put extra effort into coaching your participants in how to ask others, because people are shy of asking others, knowing the economic implications. And so giving them tools, giving them the confidence that with your communications in terms of the urgency and need and why we're doing this is going to be quite important. If, though, you've postponed your event, make sure you're keeping in touch with your participants so that they are feeling connected to the event. So it literally isn't just, you know, events being pushed back, we'll get back in touch with you. Just keep in touch in a nice way in terms of what's going on with your thinking for the event to make sure they're staying engaged. And if you've had to cancel completely for whatever reason, consider, is this a good reason to do an emergency appeal? So if you're a smaller charity where this makes up a large percentage of your revenue, could you turn this into an opportunity to reach out to all the participants, your warm cash donors, even donors of prior participants, to actually reach out to say, this is going to impact our beneficiaries as a consequence. Would you please support us? So something to consider there. Direct marketing. Let's just take a quick look at that area, and we'll look at the impact that was currently reported in the survey that went out. So what we're seeing at the moment from feedback there was that there's little impact at this very moment in time, but there was certainly uncertainty for the coming period, as Martin mentioned. We've got some divergent thinking that became apparent here, because you've got some charities report that they are looking at cutting acquisition budgets into the future, be it regular giving or cash appeals. Some were maintaining, and also saw some were looking to reduce the number of warm appeals, yet equally there was a similar number who are actually saying, well, look, we're thinking of increasing the number of warm appeals over the coming 12 months to try to make up for shortfalls in revenue that experienced elsewhere. So clearly we can see this is an area where we're not quite sure. You've got divergent strategies occurring. What we were hearing was that February appeals have generally underperformed for most. However, the thinking there was that really was the bushfires that actually drove that. And we certainly saw that also with some of our peer-to-peer events where we saw softer numbers coming through. And a number of charities were looking at how we can migrate more activity into the digital space to be a little bit more dynamic. If you're doing face-to-face, you're obviously liaising with your face-to-face suppliers, and one of the key things there that we were seeing was making sure the advocates are trained on how to operate in a pandemic, and so they're operating appropriately. And we had a number of charities who were also citing that they were seeing a slight increased number of cancellations, which obviously comes back to that feeling of economic uncertainty that Martin just spoke to. So looking ahead, so let's just quickly start with appeals. One of the key things that we feel that we definitely need to look at is making sure that we actually address the crisis that we have within the appeal and within your communications. Don't just ignore it, because obviously this is very dominant in almost everybody's lives, and to not have it in there would appear a little bit tone deaf. So make sure that that's there, and the FIA are going to be putting up shortly to share templates and resources and tools for anyone slightly uncertain as to how best to do that, and there'll be more on that from emails to come shortly from the FIA. Emergency appeals, this is definitely something to consider, particularly if you can already talk to revenue that has been decreased. What can you do in an emergency appeal, both in mail, phone, SMS, or via digital channels? Importantly though, don't keep it organisational centric, because even with an emergency, what your donors do want to hear is the impact on beneficiaries, not you as an organisation. I think that's really important to just keep in mind. Look at how we could use digital channels more extensively. But again, it's not just about literally just taking what you've done previously. It is about making sure that you're reframing the messaging right for digital channels. So speak to others or get advice on how best to do that. If you've got services directly related to or beneficiaries at high risk of COVID-19, that's worth bringing into your appeals. Again, it comes back to the tangibility of the problem and the need and the urgency. So make sure you're pulling that across. And consider, what does acquisition look like over this period? And there's no absolute right or wrong to this, because it probably will vary depending upon your organisation. And how you acquire donors is how mature your acquisition program looks like, and because there could be good opportunities to potentially acquire new donors here if you've got services directly related to COVID, as an example. But then it may be also that acquisition right at this moment in time may not be right for your organisation. So that's a question that you'd need to ask: is it right for you? We need to consider potential supply chain disruptions. We don't know what that will look like, but it may occur. And we, because they're talking that the economic implications could be much greater than the GFC, particularly for Australia, who obviously we didn't see, because of the the economic situation wasn't so bad here in Australia. That is not going to be the case for this, according to most economic forecasters. So we may end up having a reduction in the number of gifts being made and the averages that they're donating as people are feeling economically uncertain. Regular giving. What we're hearing from the sector at the moment is that it's okay right now. However, one of the key things to start to put really close attention to is the number of cancellations and declines on credit cards, and start putting tracking codes in on people who are quoting the crisis as a reason for cancellation or financial reasons. Are you seeing that spike? One of the key things, obviously, if there's a lockdown, this could hit face-to-face very hard, and so that's something to consider over the coming 6 months if we have a lockdown. Digital two-step could be an opportunity here to continue to work well, because we know, obviously, as Martin spoke about, people being at home, and if they're working from home, they may be also more likely to answer their phone, which we know is becoming harder and harder to get people to pick up these days. But again, seek advice on how to execute that from others that are doing it, just to make sure, if you've never done it before you wade in, you do need to make sure you get that right. The economic implications are likely to affect this segment if unemployment starts rising, which again, through companies laying off staff, may well occur. And so that's something we're going to need to factor into our budgeting over the next 12 months. And consider offering giving holidays for donors who wish to cancel, but don't fight it. Otherwise you risk long-term brand damage. Just quickly on relationship fundraising and the impact currently. The biggest areas that this is occurring right now is through corporates and event support, because obviously corporates tend to be big event supporters, and so obviously that impact has already been felt, as well as obviously any of those kind of major donor events or even gifts and wills events. They've obviously had to be cancelled. And so 1 in 5 charities are reporting reduced engagement from corporates, and there are signs of challenges occurring due to the lack of focus, for obvious reasons, because the businesses or major donors tend to focus inwards during times of crisis. Corporate volunteering activities are being cancelled, and concern particularly with things like corporate support, because we're right in the middle of that budget setting cycle right now, and so for the FY21, and so then that may have an impact over the next 12 months if people are at that stage of feeling we probably should be very conservative. And some foundations have reported to some charities that they're looking at a reduction in grants of between 10 to 50%. So looking ahead, corporate partnerships, obviously there's that budget cycle concerns, which may mean we're in for a challenging FY21. But really, in terms of advice, try to secure time with your corporate partners as soon as possible to seek their ongoing commitment to their partnership. Some corporates obviously are less affected than others. As a general guidance, most corporates will be, but now might be the time, I guess, to approach toilet roll manufacturers for their corporate partnership, because there are certain sectors that are booming. So don't categorically rule all out. We do know from past economic downturns that often this tends to be one of the most impacted forms of giving, as corporates tend to protect their bottom line and prioritise staff and shareholders. We know that volunteering is very likely to be impacted. And so consider also, are there opportunities here for virtual skilled volunteering that people could actually do and contribute from home? Is this an opportunity to actually think differently about volunteering? And you know, also I think we as a sector can leverage that corporates today, if you think about 10 years ago when we had the GFC, corporates today really are expected to play a much greater role than they were from a community perspective. So will we see a difference in outcome from the way that charities interact over the next 12 months with our sector or not? Slight unknown there. But again, this makes for another reason for an emergency appeal if your corporate partners drop out and you have programs at risk of closure. Trust and foundations, again, there is an opportunity here if your organisation is undertaking COVID-19 related projects. And some of the people in the research talked about foundations that they have good relations with as being quite interested in supporting organisations with this. And we know, again, just because of the grant making process, that this is likely to be affected because of the share market losses we've been experiencing, and it is likely to take some time to get back to where we were when you consider that we are where we were 17 years ago in terms of the Australian stock market. But try to secure time with your foundation key contacts and stakeholders to explore their commitment to their ongoing projects. Major donors, again, really the focus here is around migrating relationships to phone, email and virtual engagement with video conferencing. Really starting to look at what's the clear articulation of need during this crisis, making sure that you really understand exactly what it is that you're asking them for over this next 12 months and demonstrate that urgency and their continued support. It is likely to be impacted over the coming year due to the asset losses of this segment. But saying that, mid to long-term prospects are likely to be still strong for this donor group. So it's important not to deprioritise and to continue all the good stewardship work that we as a sector do with this, and to ensure that they're as engaged as possible. But ask when it's felt and if it's felt appropriate based on the circumstances that are occurring. So overarching, just some key, very practical things. Donor processing. This has come up for a few organisations in terms of, well, if we're all working from home, how do we process responses? And something to consider is having very small numbers in the office on rosters, processing checks, credit card transactions that come in, so that you can stay on top of donations. But communicate to donors that processing may take a little longer than normal. How might you reallocate resources to donor care? There's a real opportunity here for donor care, particularly if you reallocate work. Say, as an example, you may have an event manager who hasn't got an event at the moment, but actually they could be calling donors, particularly older donors who are in a vulnerable category or isolated donors, to make sure that they know that as a valued supporter, we're thinking of them. Reforecast more frequently than you may do at the moment. Look at considering creating worst and best case scenarios to keep senior leadership informed as to where we could end up. One thing I really would defend against is panic-driven sweeping fundraising cuts, because it can happen where, you know, boards or senior leadership has just cut everything, you know, that kind of panic moment. But it's not the time to be cutting back on those supporters that are your loyal, ongoing, generous supporters. Keep, you know, that activity should continue to occur, and you know, we urge you to defend that, unless the returns, as you know, as we're going, the returns are indicating that actually things aren't going that well. Then of course start to consider, well, what are the appropriate pieces to cut? But what history does show is that those that cut early and indiscriminately tend to, well, always pretty much end up worse off at the end of the crisis, and it takes them years to recover. So it is around not cutting being strategic with what you're cutting, making sure that you're cutting things that aren't necessarily making a particularly good profit or are more awareness based. So cutting costs is a good thing to do in this environment, but making sure you're cutting the costs that aren't harming your short, medium or long-term revenue. And lastly, look at how you can work best as a team when you're working remotely, particularly if you're not used to doing so, and making sure that you're having regular virtual check-ins. And that is where I will hand back to Martin, which you'll need to unmute, Martin.
Yep, got it. Thanks, Marcus. So I think there's some really clear messages in there about pruning, not cutting. So, you know, cut back the things that aren't going to affect your future growth, but trim on those that will. So we also asked in the survey what help people felt they needed. And this really kind of fell into these categories of, I basically need to be able to function effectively. I need to be able to do my job. I need to know that I'm being supported and I've got clarity of direction and priority from my leadership and management. I need to feel good about the work I'm doing and supported and connected to others so that I know I'm not alone. And this is a really important role where I think webinars like this and other activities that FIA can put on is going to be really important. Most of us do our jobs because of the people we work with and the impact it has. And it's going to be easy to lose track of that when we're all stuck at home and somewhat distanced from each other and from the front line of the work that we do. I need to know what to do and what other people are doing, and some evidence behind the decisions that I'm making. So one of the things we want to suggest or explore, I suppose, is what data should people be gathering and sharing to work out what is actually going on so that we can make evidence-based decisions, rather than everybody going out and testing everything and all having to carry the same sort of risks and costs. How can we share some of that information so we can learn from each other? There was a fair bit of comment from people in the survey around media and the sensitivity. Well, two issues really, sensitivity and sensationalism. So some comments about the sensationalism of the coverage of the current crisis, but also some worry about the sensitivity of how will our need to continue fundraising, to continue helping the people that we help, who are often going to be in greater need, how is that going to be viewed and how do we manage that, and who's got our back, I suppose, as a sector to represent us to media and to make sure that we're influencing government around the support that we might need from them and messaging to the public to say, look, actually, people are still getting cancer, people are still homeless. All of these problems haven't gone away just because we're focused on something bigger and more sinister and scary and unknown. We asked in the survey how the sort of subject areas, I suppose, that people were interested in working together on. The key thing from this was pretty much everything. So most people are saying, yep, I want to connect with other people. And there's a strong desire to get it right. We want to get this right for our organizations, but we're not quite sure how that is. And so being able to talk to others, to work out not necessarily what the definitive answers are, but at least what some of the questions are, and to work out how can I make the best and most informed decisions? How can I stay abreast of what's going on in the sector? And finally, we asked people in the survey, what advice would you offer to other fundraisers? And again, this is a great example of our generosity of spirit and willingness to share. And so really it came into these sort of four areas. Marcus, if you can just advance to the next one. So kind of, there's 1,000 things that you've been meaning to do for ages. This might be the time to get some of those things done. So rather than panicking, let's plan. Let's think about, okay, how can I use my time for the best effect to build my long-term fundraising program, to strengthen the relationships I have with my donors and make sure that we are best equipped to recover when recovery comes along. To engage, to ensure that the people who matter know exactly what you're doing as an organization, and not just telling them, but actually giving the opportunity to really connect with them, talk to them, listen to them, and help them to understand where you're at, why you're doing what you're doing, what the possible implications are. There was an awful lot of comment from other fundraisers about their advice, which was around keep calm, don't panic, this will get better. everybody's there for each other, and that sense of unity. You know, I think it is one of the most wonderful and defining characteristics of our sector is we share in a way that most other commercial businesses would just never dream of. And we have a very genuine and strong sense of commitment to each other and to helping others succeed. And that's what is going to get us through this more than anything else, is that sense of purpose that we have. So with that, I'll just hand over to Catherine just to sort of wrap up with some of the issues around what next, and then we're probably going to have a little bit of time for some questions, which I think Helen is collating.
Thank you, Martin and Marcus. The information presented and some of the implications are so helpful. We do have time for some questions. So if anybody has some, could you please put them into the chat box? At the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat function. You can type them in. And I just wanted to alert everyone that we did have capacity for 1,000 people on this webinar, but we've had a few technical difficulties with Zoom to get everyone on. And we're really sorry about that. It is unfortunate, but we are making this available right after this session for everyone who registered, and also to share more broadly. So please, if you or your colleagues missed out, you will absolutely be able to have access to the webinar and the slides as well. So Helen, can I ask if there are any questions that we could work through in the few minutes that we've got remaining?
There is one from the start of from Martin, your slides at the start, which is asking that, trying to be an optimist, can you give us an idea of how many people could be at the lower end of the scale, i.e. the ones and twos, and how this kind of benefits their organisation? So I think we're going right back to the start kind of those slides. Need to unmute.
In terms of the sheer numbers of people who were feeling optimistic, it was about 15 out of 371. I haven't actually, because we only closed the survey last night at 7 o'clock, so I haven't actually gone back to look and see what the source of optimism for those people is, as to whether that optimism is coming because they are working in you know, a particular space that is relevant to them. So I can't really say what their source of optimism. I suspect they're organisations who have a relevant cause area or have a reasonably large regular giving portfolio that they don't think will be impacted for a period of time through cancellation, or they may have, you know, a small number of strong donors. But I haven't really looked at that in detail to go what's their source of their reason for optimism.
Okay, great. And that person came back to say it's more about actually understanding what are the opportunities they're seeing throughout this.
Well, I think, I mean, the opportunity that I would say most people are honing in on really is around digital. And as I say, that I'm not sure whether that's going to play out as being the effective thing to do. But that's certainly the area that, if we looked at the area where most people say they're going to increase or shift their investment to, it is towards that that digital area. I think we've got to do a lot of experimentation and trial to see if that becomes viable with ROIs and volume to see if that is working.
I'd agree. I'd agree with that. I mean, if we want to look through an optimistic lens just for a moment, because obviously everyone's talking about Australia and the world will be a different place at the end of this crisis. We as a sector have always struggled to make digital, outside of event-based fundraising, truly work for us as a fundraising mechanism. So I think that this crisis is going to force us to be incredibly creative and innovative, and try new things that we may not necessarily have tried before if it weren't for the crisis. And so, you know, again, if I just put an optimistic hat on for a moment, is this the moment when we can actually get some traction from an individual giving perspective at scale for the sector where we've struggled in the past? And I would like to think so, because I would like to think there will be some positives that come out of this for us as a sector. And so let's hope that that is one of the key outcomes.
Okay.
I'll just answer these two questions. Shall I answer these two questions that are there at the moment, Helen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So there's one from Jacinta here about what's the sort of evidence, I suppose, from previous, the GFC, etc. I think it would be incredibly useful, and maybe this is somewhere where Ive can help us, I'm not sure, but it'd be incredibly helpful if we could look at the actual evidence base. I know Jeremy published a thing out this morning just talking about an article from the last GFC, but I think it'd be very helpful for us to look at what was the evidence of the last GFC on different fundraising channels. And this is where I mean, if we can get to an evidence base, it's going to inform us. I think this is going to be different from the GFC, very different, because I think it's just going to hit more people more quickly. But I think that would be really useful. Eloise asks about whether we're going to do a survey of the public. We considered that before we decided to focus on doing one for fundraising practitioners. The reason we decided against doing one for the public was it was just too much. There was too much change going on, to be honest. And I think people's view from if we'd done a survey last week to this week would be so different. However, we did actually put a COVID-19 question into a donor survey that went live this morning. And although we've only got about 100 respondents so far, 62% of those donors said, no, I'm totally committed to giving to this charity. I will carry on. And I think my feeling is that people's intention to carry on giving will be there. I think the issue is going to become when they're faced with a lot of competition, and particularly from charities they may not be as loyal and committed to, and they're in a situation of questioning their future financial security. And my sense is at the moment is that we're going through sort of like some waves, if you like, of this crisis. The initial wave was, I need to express control. And so we all went and bought toilet paper and tried to protect ourselves through, because I just needed to feel I was doing something about it. I think then we're going to go into a bit more of a sort of reflection period of going, what does this actually mean for my job, for my security, for my finances in the future? And then I think we'll go into sort of an adjustment period of going, I'm going to have to change, I'm going to have to cut back, I'm going to have to reprioritize, etc. And then we'll come out with whatever new normal is. And I don't think any of us can imagine what new normal might look like. There might be some things that happen as a result of this that create stronger senses of community and society and responsibility to each other, or there might be things where we kind of bunker down and become more protectionist and isolationist. We don't know what that new normal will be like. I think in answer to Eloise's question, it would probably be really useful to have some ongoing sort of tracking or a donor panel almost, that we could check in with some people periodically. We've got a couple of charities who have set up donor panels, and maybe we could be going to some of those people and just checking in. I think it's just this difficulty of it changing so rapidly.
Okay, thank you. We actually have a couple more questions. So first of all, are there yet any strong indications of some non-for-profits using this crisis as an opportunity or an excuse to cut services and or staff?
Not that I'm aware of, certainly not that came through from the survey. Nobody had actually said we have already cut this activity. I think many not-for-profits would work on a sort of a 12-month, what I always call the survival ratio, which is basically how long can you keep going without any money. So I don't think they're seeing an immediate impact yet. But that's not to say, I mean, this is leaving aside, there's probably another whole piece to do about their ability to deliver service because of the restrictions that are in place, but that's not about their financial capacity to do it. And I'm not aware of anybody cutting jobs yet. There was certainly some nervousness from some fundraisers, particularly people on contracts, as to what would happen in the future around their job security. And I think it's one of the things when we talk about retention, I think it's really important for us to focus not just on donor retention, but talent retention. We know how hard it is to get people into the sector and to bring them up to be highly effective fundraisers. And we really need to make sure we preserve the talent we've got.
Just to add to that, I am aware of a few charities that put in hiring freezes at this moment in time, but none that I'm aware of that have actually cut staff as yet. I think, and it really depends how this plays out. Some of the more great stuff to hear, some of the nicest stories to hear from places that are actually really experiencing tough times at the moment, like Italy. some of the charities over there who've been using mission-related staff who would ordinarily be out doing mission-related activities, who obviously can't do that, have been working from home, calling donors and engaging with donors to say, thank you for your support. We wanted to check in and actually make sure that you're okay during this. So there are some great stories coming out of countries that are particularly badly affected, of how they're redeploying staff as well. Hopefully we don't get to the point where we need to do that, but it's good to see how charities are also redeploying people in creative ways.
Okay, I have one question here. If you could rate how direct mail results will be affected in a scale of mild, big, major, between now and the end, what would you say it would be? And what percentage of the remaining budgeted income should we factor into our projections? And the same for face-to-face or regular giving. Come on.
You need a crystal ball for that one.
You really do. I mean, face-to-face is all going to just come down to whether it continues or not.
Yeah.
I'm aware of at least 5 charities that have stopped in the last 3 days. So that could go to naught, or it could carry on. I think it might carry on in some areas and not others. DM, you'd have to kind of say, based on the feedback from the survey, most people are estimating at least a 20% cut in their overall fundraising income. I just think we won't know until we've got, so people who've got shoulder appeals out now, that'd be really useful to know. But of course, the big issue is just going to be the tax appeals. It's really, really hard to tell. It depends how often you've asked them. It depends what their prior giving history looked like. There are many, many variables, but I guess from an expectations management point of view, I'd be urging on the side of caution in terms of trying to manage expectations until the point where your expectations management starts meaning people go, well, you can't spend as much money, because then you're going to end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy of not raising as much because you didn't ask as many people. So there's a whole trade-off in how you manage that.
The only other piece on top of that is cancellations, depending upon the economic situation with regular giving, in terms of just, again, I touched on this before, but just the level of unemployment, the number of people that lose their jobs, or the feeling of insecurity about you might lose your job, particularly with a target demographic for regular donors, is a risk to ongoing income. And I'm aware that was in the UK during the GFC, that took a big hit for charities that had big programs. I know we say, in Australia, these economic crises don't really affect fundraising. That we've never really had an economic crisis in 30 years here in Australia. And that certainly wasn't the case in Europe and the UK, who saw some declines, some significant declines in attrition rates from their warm base, not just obviously acquisition. So that's also another thing to consider.
Okay, we've got one final question, which actually will lead us into Catherine. I presume will the answer on this one. So, are there any insights into if a stimulus package for charities can be expected from the federal government?
It's sort of hard to know what the government is doing, given all their priorities, but we certainly have reached out to the minister who asked us for some assistance on the impact and the issues that our members in the sector more broadly in fundraising are facing, and they do appear to be sensitive to that. Our colleagues in other organizations and some of our members have lobbied directly to government for assistance, and there are a variety of ways that the government could consider providing that. So we're hopeful, and FIA are continuing over the coming days to lobby and to push for some assistance, and we'll keep you posted on how we go with that.
Helen or Catherine, were you going to just mention the LinkedIn thing?
Yeah. So given that we're now just with a few minutes left, I'll just close. If there were any questions that were not answered in the chat, it looks like we got to most of them, but we certainly can do that in a follow-up. As mentioned earlier, this webinar will be available on the FIA website, and we'll provide an email to all of you so that you have the ability to go and look at the webinar. And apologies again to your colleagues and others in the sector who were not able to join us today due to our technical difficulties with Zoom. I do want to say that the results of this survey will also be published in a paper, and will be available next week. Thanks again to More Strategic. I also want to say thank you to Martin, Paul, and Marcus, please, for acting so quickly and working through a number of sleepless nights to develop the survey, do the analysis, and present the findings and implications to us today. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we were hoping to facilitate some working group or other way so that all of us could discuss together, learn from each other, share information and ideas. And so next week, we'll invite you and any interested FIA members to continue this conversation, sharing and collaborating via a LinkedIn group. And from there, we'll take your feedback on the best ways to keep that or other conversations going and how FIA can assist with that. So in closing, thank you again for joining us for this webinar. I hope you found it helpful. And thanks again to Go Fundraise for helping us to provide the access for this. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.